Thank you all for joining in. Today, we're going to be talking about 2022 trends, and Mike is going to be leading the show today on all the great things that he's discovered and the predictions that Datassential has made for the coming year and beyond. As a reminder, this is a totally interactive event. This is as much about you and your feedback and your interactions as it is about us and the stuff that we're presenting. So please hit that chat button. And when you do, you have the option to chat either just to the panelists, me and Mike, or it might say you could chat with everyone, or it might say all panelists and attendees. Make sure you choose that option so everyone can see what you want to talk about. If I could ask all of you right now to just start by saying, hey, this is where I'm coming in from, and here maybe some interesting things I'm seeing with the world of food and restaurants around me, whether it's what's going on with the vaccine mandate or how people are behaving or anything else. Just say hi to all your colleagues around, actually not just around the country, but around the world at this point too. So hit that chat button, let us know where you're chatting in from. And with that, I wanted to get started with just a quick reminder of some of the brand new content that you will find available in Report Pro. So many, maybe even most of you are using our Report Pro service today. And this is basically an unlimited buffet of incredible reports with brand new stuff being published every day or a couple of days, with over 1,000 historic reports on every topic imaginable. And I wanted to point out just a few of the latest ones that were published in just the last couple of weeks. There is a Food Bites edition, which is actually part of our free newsletter series on why food values matters. So why consumers really care about things beyond just the proposition of the food itself, but around the values and just the things that are embodied by the companies that provide those food products, or the restaurants that put them on the menu. What do companies and what do brands stand for, and why that matters to consumers? There's a look at what inflation may look like post-COVID. And I know, Mike, the last time we talked, I think you cited some economists that said maybe we could bring this thing down to 2.6, 3% or something by the end of the year, which is certainly still possible. I guess another theory that I've heard being floated is that because so many companies use FIFO accounting, first in, first out, when their costs start going up as quickly as they have, they almost have to charge more, so they still have profits to report, right? Or their valuations tank. So there's an incentive, a financial incentive beyond just the economic one of your everyday business of keeping your prices up, so to speak, which may be a challenge to getting that rate down, but I guess we'll see. I know not everyone agrees on where this is going to head, but we'll definitely track it for you. But if you check out this 5 in Focus report, it gives you our first look on where things sort of stand right now and some things you should be thinking about going forward, and where consumers are on the topic as well. And then a really great inspiration report deep dive on the adoption stage of the menu adoption cycle, and restaurants that tend to focus on adoption stage ingredients, foods, flavors, menu items. So the adoption stage is sort of like, traditionally one of the most interesting stages. This is where you get beyond just the pure, bleeding edge stuff you'd find in early inception. Now they've been vetted a little bit, and you're starting to see them picked up at other places, which signify that these trends will have some legs. So if you want to look across different types of restaurants and across different types of menus, check out this report. It really gives you a good look at sort of the up and coming world of things that are really starting to grow on menus. There's a ton of content inside of Report Pro. Again, there's new content virtually every day. We invite you to check it out. And when you're inside of our Snap interface, you do now get a little bit of an alert in that lower right-hand corner when you first sort of start the page up that shows you some of the latest pieces of content. Just click on it. It'll take you right to that piece of content, and the rest is there for you. Mike, with that, I invite you to tell us about this big pictures look and some of the more detailed stuff we're going to cover today.
Absolutely. So if you were with us 2 weeks ago, you know that webinar covered data and information from this report, which released in Report Pro at that time. So that's really the report that covers all of those big picture factors: demographic trends, political trends, economic trends. And so that kind of lays the groundwork. So we're all kind of having the same discussion about what's going to happen at that 30,000 foot view level. And then today, what we're going to get into is the other 2022 trend report that is going to release in Report Pro on Monday, actually. It's huge, 250 pages. The food bites that we released in December is actually a preview of this report. And I honestly, the stuff that's in here is crazy. Like we did 2 surveys. We did a survey in November and we did a survey in January covering 6 different macro trends and 6 different micro trends. And it all goes into this report. I mean, it covers really far out thinking stuff. It covers things that are going to impact our industry in the year ahead. And it's all very focused on our industry. So whereas, 2 weeks ago, those were things that really, impact everybody overall. This is really focused on food and flavor trends.
So Mike, just to clarify, today we're going to skim the surface of what you'll find in this 250-page report. And that report will be published this coming Monday in Report Pro. Is that right?
Exactly. So start your week next week, get into Report Pro. You can download the whole thing. And yes, I cannot emphasize enough that we are skimming the surface. We only have an hour today. Like I said, the actual report is 250 pages. Even the topics that we cover today, we are only going to get into a portion of what's actually in the report on those particular topics.
We better get started.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do just kind of want to cover really quickly the ones that are in the report so you know everything that's in here. The ones that are bolded here are the things that we're going to get into today. But so the macro trends, so we cover both macro and micro trends every year. That's kind of how we always organize it. And the macro trends tend to be those things that impact all of us in the industry. They tend to be really, really all-encompassing things that will impact us for years to come. And so the things that we cover outside of what we're going to cover today are we have a section on the idea that meats can actually be better than the animal-based meats that we have today based on animals. So, some of these plant-based options or some of these lab-grown options, maybe the foods and flavors and textures that we have available in the future will actually transcend the options that we have available that come from animals. And we have some research on that. The changing taste section is just about generational differences and how their tastes are changing. I think the most interesting stat from that section is that we asked consumers, if you could eat only one cuisine for the rest of your life, which cuisine would it be? And when you look at the demographic differences, for older demographics, it's Italian cuisine. They immediately go to Italian. That's what they would eat forever. And then when you start to look at younger generations, you start to see that shift. And for Gen Z, it's Latin and Mexican cuisine. That's the #1 cuisine for them that they would eat. And so that really does have big implications for what we're going to put on menus and on retail shelves in the future. And then the last 2 sections there.
With a very old demographic, and almost every restaurant was Italian.
Yeah,
how many Italian restaurants do you need? It's crazy.
And then the last 2 sections, I think we're actually going to get into in a future webinar, but we actually brought some of the most futuristic thinkers at Datassential together, and we came up with what we think our vision of the restaurant and the market of the year 2050 could be. And so honestly, those are so kind of huge and crazy that they deserve their own webinar. So I think we can focus on those in the future.
Well, okay, let's get started.
All right. And then these are the topics in the microtrend section. I won't go through all these again, but I will say that we cover Eastern European cuisine as our cuisine to watch. We cover some crave drivers that really drive high craveability scores in our scores platform, and the micro influencers, which are those more targeted social media influencers. We have some great data just on the general differences between the social media platforms that consumers get their food information from. But let's just jump into it. Let's immediately get into this first section here. Which is, so this is a term that you talked about last time, Jack, which is the COVID generation. And I don't want to say we're absolutely calling any generation the COVID generation. I don't know if any, generation wants to be known as the COVID generation. But I think, what's going to start to happen when COVID is not such a top of mind, always in the news, concern day in and day out, is that we're going to start to grapple with a lot of the long-term implications of COVID, of this, all-encompassing all-encompassing pandemic that, was a global event that we experienced going on our third year. And so when you consider other events that were like that in the past, it's things like the Great Depression. It's things like World War II. It's things like previous recessions. And so I think that's kind of, the tack that we took in this section is to consider some of those long-term implications from that same standpoint. It's a global event that really impacts all of us. And so if you look at, some of the previous generations and how they were impacted by some of those large global events, it's probably things that, maybe people, on the webinar today or people's grandparents or parents, you really remember them, kind of their food choices really being impacted by the Depression or by the war. I remember my great-grandparents, they had a larder in the basement. It was a giant room and it was just filled with shelf-stable foods. And they were frugal people in general anyway. But I remember my parents telling me like, oh yeah, they grew up during the Great Depression. They never want to be out of food. That was a life-changing event for them. And so I think if you, think of, past events like that and how they, really impacted consumers in the future, you'd start to wonder, in the future, are, people going to talk about our generations and be like, well, these people grew up during COVID and, they were at home and, the shelves were, empty. And you're going to hear some of those same things. And then on the next grade here, so you also had the opposite thing happen. So you had some consumers in the past when you came out of, rationing, when you came out of the Great Depression, who were super frugal, who, didn't want to waste food, who, didn't spend a lot of money. And then you had others who really couldn't wait for that, time of abundance. They couldn't wait to get past it, really, put things on the table again and showcase to their children all of the great options that they had. After the war, one of the cool statistics that when we were researching this came out is that sales of oregano increased over 5,000% after World War II, because you had all of these soldiers coming back. They had been in Italy. They called it the pizza spice, and they wanted those same, interesting, to them exotic foods and flavors that they had seen, overseas when they came back to the US. So, in other ways, the war, the Great Depression really impacted what we ate and created, what has now become a foodie culture. And we kind of see that same thing when we talk about COVID in the number of consumers who say, I can't wait for the roaring 20s to come back, or I can't wait to get out there again. I've been at home and, I haven't been able to experience some of those, awesome live experiences or the hospitality that I'm used to. And so, we do see from some consumers that, maybe we are going to see some of that kind of return to, those more exciting options after we get past the pandemic.
Headlines.
And yeah, these are just a few of the headlines. I feel like every single paper out there has printed some story about how it's really going to change the way that we live. And I think, that's kind of our thesis for this section, is that this is going to be, really a demographic changing event. This really will define generations into the future, and define what they buy and what they purchase and how they buy and where they purchase those things from. And on the next slide here, I believe this is the statistic that, we asked consumers, do you think this is a life-changing event? And 83% of consumers do think the pandemic has permanently changed the way that we live in some fashion.
That's actually permanently changed. 5 out of 6 people think that there'll be, and this is, I think, higher than we saw earlier on when no one quite realized how long this would drag on for. They thought we'd sort of be done with it, and then maybe a few things would be different, but this is a pretty big number. And I'd actually would be curious to ask everyone here, what do you think about the future of masking? Do you think that we basically will have, masks be common in perpetuity, long after COVID? Are masks here to stay forever? Mike, I don't think you'll bias the results too much one way or the other, but what do you think?
But I know we've asked similar questions to this in the past, and I don't remember what people said. I don't know. I feel like it will be maybe somewhat close to 50-50.
Yeah, I'm looking at the numbers now. This is actually really interesting. So I'm looking at the numbers now, and it's about 60-40 in favor of yes. But I can actually see the votes come in when they come in. And initially, it started like 80-20. So the people that felt yes instantly said
immediately.
Yes. And the people that thought no waited a little bit longer. to say no. So I don't know if that means much, but I think this is a higher number than when we've asked this same question to this group in the past, that I think there's more certainty now that things like masking will be here forever. I don't know. My guess always has been that here, I'll share the results out, has been that in the long run, probably at any given time, 10% of people will be wearing masks wherever you are. It'll never look weird to anyone because it'll just still be, if not a majority thing, at least common enough that you just sort of expect to see it wherever you go. Okay, so about 60-40. How about eating healthier?
Yeah, so we actually asked all of these consumers, we gave them a free text question. We said, just tell us whatever you want to say. How do you think your life will be different when it comes to the foods and flavors and things that you eat in the future because of the pandemic? So we asked 1,000 Gen Pop consumers. We got about 900 something good responses. And we went through each and every one of those and kind of pulled some of those themes out. The number one theme that came up is eating healthier. Consumers either want to eat healthier, they felt like they understood ways to eat healthier because they've been living at home and they've been cooking for themselves. Number two was cooking skills. We heard from a number of consumers that they learned how to cook, they enjoyed cooking. I think that was the thing that was most surprising, is it wasn't just like I learned how to cook because I had to learn how to cook. It was the number of consumers who said, I learned how to cook and really enjoyed it. Or I learned how to cook and I found out that I'm a good cook. And the things that I make at home can be comparable to what I get at a restaurant. I think the next slide here is one of those answers that we got from one of the consumers, which this is pretty emblematic of a lot of the answers that we got. So this is somebody who said that they had been eating out more prior to the pandemic. And then because of the pandemic, they started eating and cooking with their spouse. And they found out that they really enjoyed it. They found out that they liked doing that at home with their spouse. And so, I mean, that's absolutely, the type of thing that could be a long-term impact for consumers.
I wonder how much of the opposite has happened too.
We did. I remember for the 2021 trends, we did ask, consumers, are you getting tired of cooking at home? And there is that portion of consumers. This one is probably no surprise to our industry, but the number of consumers who say that I've gotten used to takeout and delivery, particularly on the CPG side. So particularly the number of consumers who started using supermarket delivery or pickup for the first time. We saw not only have they started using it, but that they really enjoy it, that it's become a big part of their lifestyle. And so
I think this goes back to your earlier point about how this maybe changed things forever, or how there's an entire generation impacted by this. So you do have folks now that have sort of grown up because of COVID in this place where delivery is your first option, whereas before that wasn't really the case. So will that be their first option going forward as well, because it's become such an ingrained behavior at that point?
And my parents are a great example of that. Prior to COVID, my parents never used grocery delivery. And then during the pandemic, it's now their preferred way. They actually call up their supermarket and they know their favorite manager at the supermarket and they tell her what they want. So it has changed them forever. Yeah. And this is a quote from somebody that, just said the same thing. And again, we see that same kind of sentiment that consumers are saying, which that they like to see, they like to be at home. They like to pick up food and bring it into their home.
Scarcity, what is going on?
And then, I mean, so some of those are kind of more positive changes, or at least not necessarily negative changes. But I think the most negative term that we saw come up is shortages, scarcity. I can't really overstate the number of consumers who, when they talk about going to the, supermarket or grocery store and seeing those empty shelves, that it really did impact them, whether it was, just psychologically for themselves, or whether it was a parent who felt like they couldn't purchase the things that they, would normally purchase for their family. And so this next slide, is kind of emblematic of a lot of the answers that we got from consumers who said that they're going to stock up more in the future. They're always going to have shelf-stable foods around. And so this is probably the answer that is most similar to answers that you see from people who grew up during the Depression, which is that, I don't want to see those empty shelves again. I want to make sure that I have things at home.
But I think this is maybe a little bit different than the real panic buying we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, right? When people were buying 5 grocery carts worth of stuff.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think it's necessary. Yeah, I'm going to keep, 10 packages of toilet paper in my house at all times, but I am going to keep maybe 1 extra at all times. Yeah. Or, we heard a lot of shelf-stable items. I'm going to keep beans around all the time because I know I can always cook beans. And part of that is, leads into this stat, which is that 71% of consumers think that there's going to be another pandemic of the same size or larger than the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you do have that mindset that at some point in the future we are going to have another pandemic, then of course that's only going to exacerbate those kind of actions like, stocking up on more shelf-stable foods.
How are those like emergency meal kit companies doing? Like, weren't they had amazing business for a while? Are they still popular? Or
the MREs? Yeah, I know they were doing really well, and I still see them advertised all the time. So, I'm getting bright here. You can see when literally the sun only comes out when we do a webinar, and then I turn into a ghost.
You're getting a little bit brighter. It's okay.
And so our next section that we looked at, and it does kind of lead in from the previous section a bit, is the real focus on mind health. So, for the past however many years since we coined the term, healthy 3.0, which is that real focus on functional foods, and that consumers really want healthy foods to do something for them. They want that positive nutrition. It's not necessarily, about removing things from your foods. We've been talking about functional foods for years. Well, I don't think it's any surprise, right now, after, the pandemic, after all the anxiety that consumers have experienced, that, the function that we see a lot of consumers really gravitating towards is, foods that really speak to their mind health. And we specifically say mind health because it's not just mental health, although mental health is a part of this, but it's also just, brain health in general. And part of what we talk about in the report is, the aging population and concerns, over, mental deterioration and dementia and Alzheimer's, and, ways that the food industry can really speak to that. But, again, it's not really a surprise that this is, an area that consumers want to see a lot of innovation in. These are the types of headlines that are out there right now. We're heading into year 3 of a global health crisis. We see all of these various industries where people are just burned out. We see, medical professionals, we see teachers, we see parents that are burned out. But then, of course, there are larger issues that are at play too. So, there's political polarization in the country. There's the climate crisis. And so all of these, really do weigh on consumers. And so, for that reason, I don't think it's necessarily surprising that we see a focus on, wanting foods and ingredients that really support consumers, mental health, anti-anxiety, options that are out there.
Yeah, one thing I don't know if we've looked at, or maybe we have, is if we have surging anxiety in the country, right, in historically high levels. Do folks who sort of treat that with, let's say, medication, do they feel like that's enough, or are they also looking for anxiety-reducing foods on top of that? Like, do they get a prescription like, okay, I'm good to go, or are they looking for other stuff, overall, and what they eat and drink and how they live?
Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Some of the data speaks to that actually on the next screen here about what consumers want from self-care. But I know we do have some data that specifically goes into that in the new healthy keynote as well, which is in Report Pro. But so that term that you probably hear all the time in relation to this, and I feel like we're hearing it a lot now because it's January and you hear a lot about, health goals for the year ahead, is self-care. And so, self-care is one of those terms that we heard, prior to the pandemic that, was really growing. And then all of a sudden we see it everywhere all over again. And so we wanted to understand from consumers, what do they consider self-care to be? And so it really is, maybe perhaps unsurprisingly, about oneself. So the number one answer that consumers said, 80% of consumers agreed with that, is that taking time for oneself is what, defines self-care to them. And so, I think for the food industry, the thing to really consider is, what does that mean for the consumer? What does taking time for oneself look like? And then how do we play into that? Is there a way for the food industry to really become a part of, that self-care, that taking time for oneself, that part of their day or their week?
As more people don't think of shopping as self-care, right?
Yeah.
Isn't retail therapy supposed to be a thing?
Yeah, and that's why we asked the question. You hear that a lot, and you do hear a lot of retailers say, take time for yourself, come shopping. But 30% is still a good amount of consumers. I will say the demographic differences here. Younger generations were a lot more likely to say that, like, getting out there and meeting people was important to them. Kind of those, like extroverted, personalities, that they were a lot more likely to say that, whereas older generations weren't necessarily likely to say that. And then when you
Oh.
consider, the ways that we take care of ourselves, the ways that we take care of our mental health, it really has become, a part of our daily life. So it's a lot more intertwined with how we live on a day-to-day basis. It's not necessarily, okay, once a week, I go see my therapist. That's my, moment of, making sure I take care of myself mentally, and then I live the rest of my life. Now, we have these apps. We've talked about this on these webinars before. I use this app, Calm. I think it's fantastic. Take 10 minutes out of your day and meditate and relax a little bit. We've seen, the apps like Better Health and Talkspace, where you can just text your therapist at any given point in the day and you can talk to them. And so, when you see this really becoming intertwined in consumers' daily lives, that also means that there's a possibility for it to bump up more into the food occasion. So maybe, you're talking to your therapist over lunchtime, or maybe you're talking to your therapist while you're preparing dinner.
Tell me if you feel the same way, and I invite everyone in chat to chime in too, but I guess to me, and I'm going off no specific evidence, just my perception, it feels like 30 years ago, maybe, if you said that you had a therapist, the presumption was that maybe there was something wrong with you. But now having a therapist is like having a dentist. It's just almost sort of expected and really quite normal. Is that the case, or is my perception off?
No, absolutely. We actually get into this more in the full report, but yes, the destigmatization of mental health and depression. There's actually a great advertising campaign from Better Health, which is one of those telehealth or teletherapy services, and it's that exact thing. It's that it's okay. We have a video of it in the report, but it's a cowboy who's been bitten by a rattlesnake, and he walks it off. I'll be okay. I'll be fine. And their kind of campaign is, at some points it's okay to ask for help. And I absolutely, particularly in younger generations, think that stigma is going away.
I remember this story.
We see, yeah, this was an interesting story. So we do see a number of brands kind of, taking a stance when it comes to mental health, and considering, how, their use of, various things really plays into their own consumer bases, mental health. But so this is Lush. It's a cosmetics and, kind of lifestyles brand. And so they actually announced at the end of last year that they were going to drop all of their social media accounts. And this came out after there was some reports coming out that some social media services had a detrimental impact on teen self-image and their perception of their own body image. And so Lush said, until that we feel like, they've taken steps to really make sure that that isn't the case anymore, we're actually going to drop all of our social media usage. So you do see brands out there, really engaging with consumers in, their kind of mental health goals. And we absolutely see, a huge number of products really related to this, related to self-care. This is one that I think a lot of people have seen at this point. So Recess, which is, a soda brand, and you see it right there on the can itself. It's promising that you will be calm, cool, and collected after you, drink this drink. Whether that's true, whether, they can actually live up to this promise. But, we do see quite a number of, particularly beverages. I would say when we were researching this section, it tended to be beverages that were coming up the most. You see here that they use hemp extract and adaptogens to really accomplish these goals. We saw a number of products, showcasing CBD. Obviously, we see the growth of cannabis also related to this, but certainly a huge number of products out there. There's even some humorous ones in the report. There's one called like Effin' Cool It, which is just a funny brand that's in the report.
Yeah, I mean, this is great because this takes so many things that are individually trends that we see in our trends data and our many trends data and puts them basically inside of a can. You have flavors like ginger, hibiscus, and chai. You have adaptogens, you have hemp. You got so much going on, and it's in service of healthy 3.0 functional foods and beverages, and in this case, mind health, all in a can. So it's a pretty good poster child for trends today.
And consumers do want them. So when we ask consumers, are you likely to purchase foods or, beverages that really support mental well-being? You can see the numbers aren't even close here. Well over half of consumers say they're at least very likely. And the vast majority of consumers say they're at least somewhat likely. And the numbers are even higher for millennials. So millennials were the generation that were even more interested in foods that support their mental health and well-being. So it is an area where, consumers really do want to see products from our industry to support their goals.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen too is a bit of an evolution, whereas maybe previously more consumers would have doubted whether food and beverage products could actually achieve this. More are accepting of it, and partially this is, just exposure to a lot of functional foods and particularly beverages, right, over the last few years that are just like, oh yeah, it's normal to see something that promotes, gut health or something else, so why not mind health? I see it on enough products that I sort of believe that it probably does something.
And that's a great transition to this next slide, which is a question that we asked, which is, do you agree with the statement that food can be medicine? And again, the vast majority of consumers do agree with this statement. 83% of consumers strongly, or at least somewhat, agree that food can be medicine. So they do think that that it really does have a place, in their, physical and mental health.
But to be clear, if we asked consumers, would you eat this thing on screen, you'd get about 5%. So is this like ginseng, or what is
Ginseng,
this?
yeah, yep, exactly.
That gets really expensive too, right? Isn't it like some ginsengs that's like thousands of dollars or something?
Yeah. One that, I don't know, in the Midwest at least, there's some people that grow wild ginseng, and you can find it like on Facebook Marketplace, and they sell it for crazy amounts.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I'm getting so bright, and it's literally like, it's literally just the sun reflecting off the calendar on my desk here. So we got into it a little bit on the webinar 2 weeks ago, and we played it up. We, talked about that we're going to discuss it on this webinar. And I think this is like the topic of conversation for 2022. This is, going to be the year of the metaverse. Whether you're excited about that, whether you're already tired about hearing about the metaverse, I don't think that, we can't say that you shouldn't at least have a passing idea of what the metaverse will be and how it could impact your business.
So let me ask a question. So at a top level, can you describe what metaverse means? I don't know if that's even possible or attempt to.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2, why is it called metaverse versus like omniverse or something like that? What does the meta part refer to?
These are great transitions to each slide. So if you go to the next slide, make sure you have a definition.
Oh my God, look at
that. Yeah. So, at its very basic, and nobody, perfectly agrees on how they define the metaverse. You can define it really broadly or very specifically. Generally, I think we can kind of agree that, it's a virtual environment, or it could be a series of environments that kind of live next to each other that a user can inhabit. So it's a way of inhabiting a virtual space. So you can socialize, you can build things, you can purchase goods, and you have an avatar within this virtual space. So that's basically what a metaverse is.
I feel like Arby's has to create Meatverse or something. Just flip 2 of those characters around, and that would be a very interesting reality.
Just go to the
universe of meat. Yeah.
When we don't have it in this particular presentation in this webinar, but then the full report, where there actually is a foodverse, which is a food-centric digital space.
So what do you all think? Knowing basically sort of what the metaverse is at a high level, or the term, do you think it's all hype, or is this going to be a big thing in the future? Is it mostly just hype, or is it mostly legitimate? I will give you my opinion on this, which is I think it's going to be, I don't want to bias too many answers, but we've had so many votes already that I probably can't, even if I wanted to. I think it's going to be gigantic. And I also am not quite sure if it's going to be good for humankind either. I mean, if we live in a world where we're already so attached to our devices, if now we're mounting things on our heads and living in that reality for a big chunk of our life, could that really be a good thing? I mean, I don't know.
And that's a lot of the conversation that you see happening right now is, when social media was first coming along, if it was possible for us to foresee some of the negative impacts of social media, how might we have created, social media in a different way? And so is there a possibility for us to do that in the future with the metaverse?
Yeah, so most of us think that the metaverse is going to be a thing. The question is how big, but I mean, all of those like movies that you've seen, I don't know, like Ready Player One and those other things where people are just living with a headset on, we are sort of speeding toward that reality. If you think about it, we're already so attached to our phones, right? And eventually that headset will become, a pair of eyeglasses that maybe there'll be special contact lenses or something at some point. I think we will be in this thing. And I don't know. hopefully it'll be good. I'm not totally convinced it's going to be a net positive, but we'll see.
These numbers are actually surprising to me. I thought most people would say that it would be just.
You think most people would have said no, or that it was?
Yeah, I think, and maybe it's just a function of the audience that we have here and that we've been hearing so much about how the metaverse will impact the food space. But I think if you ask average consumers, they think, yeah, it's just like some weird hyped up term.
You have to consider one of the biggest companies on earth completely rebranded themselves to support this one proposition. It's not like they were an unsuccessful dying company, right? You have to really believe in it to say, hey, I'm going to get behind this.
I'm not saying I think it's overhyped. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's where, so this next, percentage that we have on the next screen here, I think that alone, that, Facebook rebranding itself as Meta and really that play, that they're engaging in, to really kind of position themselves as a leader in metaverse technology is what has increased awareness among consumers so much. So this is a question that we asked this month, actually. So it's incredibly recent data, and half of consumers have heard of the metaverse at this point.
Yeah, and that number is going to rapidly increase over the course of the, I mean, that's pretty crazy because what, 6 months ago, like hardly anybody's heard the term.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think if you ask them to define it, it would be a much smaller percentage of people, but at least they've heard the term at this point. And it's not necessarily a new idea. We've been, engaging in digital spaces for years now. So this is a screenshot from The Sims. So The Sims is just a great example of a metaverse, where you're inside of a space, you're interacting with other people, and you have a digital avatar. And I think, if you don't use digital spaces like this already, it's surprising to people how much money is already exchanging hands in these virtual spaces, how many brands that we're very familiar with and use every day are also selling digital options within these spaces. So this screenshot is actually, it's a fashion brand that is selling clothes within The Sims. So you can actually pay, I believe it's $5, and you get access to the digital collection of their previous season's collection of clothes within the space. Adidas and Nike are selling NFTs at this point. The amount of digital goods that people are already buying, has increased a lot, in just the past year.
We talked about NFTs before, which is fairly controversial too. Now, I mean, this looks a little bit hokey, this particular thing that's on screen, but imagine at a time when it's utterly photorealistic and you can't distinguish the graphics from the reality you would normally see before your eyes. If you ever go to YouTube, you could maybe just search in YouTube Unreal Engine 5 and look at just some of the graphic demos of things that'll be in video games soon. Then eventually in 3D spaces like this, or virtual reality spaces like this, it looks basically like lifelike stuff. So pretty amazing.
But Jack, you're giving away things that we're about to talk about.
Oh no.
No. So this is when we were researching this is something that came up over and over again, which is just for younger consumers, existing in these digital spaces is second hat to them. There are a number of kids over the past 2 years who've been having their birthday parties in games like Roblox. There was one kid in one article, he preferred his birthday party to be in Roblox. He actually didn't want a birthday party in the real world. So if you consider these younger consumers who already feel very comfortable spending hours and hours at a time in digital spaces, and exactly what you just said, in the future, if they get to be more, hyper realistic, what that will mean for those generations,
And aren't some performers doing virtual concerts now and making huge money, huge real world dollars on virtual concerts?
Absolutely, yeah. And, a lot of people on this, webinar have probably been to a virtual event in the past year. Some of those concerts were, due to COVID and you couldn't necessarily go to a concert. Maybe you went to a virtual I remember there was a virtual conference I went to last year where I got into a virtual elevator, the virtual doors opened up and I was in a virtual lobby and I could walk up to people and speak to their avatars at this virtual conference. So,
maybe that's a question. I mean, how many of you, so I would challenge, I would bet that less than half the folks on this webinar right now have actually spent real time in one of those types of virtual environments, not watching a pre-recorded concert, but actually interacting in this virtual world for, let's say, more than an hour. If you have, I don't know, let us, if you have or you haven't, let us know in chat. I'm actually curious. I might be wildly off, but I feel like it's not everybody just yet.
Oh, no, I don't. Yeah, absolutely don't think it's everybody. I think a lot more have done it because of, the past year, and we couldn't necessarily do things, but it's certainly not universal. And I think one of the things that you hear is the people who have done it, it's not always a great experience. It can be kind of painful. The technology isn't necessarily there yet, but that's what you were just talking about, Jack. So the next screen is, the technologies of the future are really designed to kind of take those pain points away, to make these environments feel really hyper realistic. Facebook is working on virtual reality technology that's tactile. So you can actually feel the things, that you're touching in these digital environments. So I think you've talked about this in the past as well. I would love to, try to use this technology, but this is a technology from Google called Project Starline. And it's basically, a digital interface that uses, a 3D kind of, avatar of somebody that you're talking to that feels hyper realistic. So the screen in front of you is a 3D representation of the person that you're talking to. And to some extent, it feels like that person is actually in the room with you. You're seeing their facial expressions, you're making, eye contact with them. So imagine what that could mean for the future. Maybe you go into a restaurant and the person, at the counter who's taking your order is not actually in the restaurant with you. It's something like this, where you sit down at a table and, there's a screen across from you and you can have lunch with somebody from anywhere in the world. And there's none of those pain points that we have now because it's so hyper realistic.
It is amazing. I mean, I think we saw the original tweet from Google when they posted this, but I'm sure you could find it on YouTube or something. Now you should look at the demo of this thing. It's really, really cool. Project Starline, right?
Yeah, Project Starline, yeah. And then this is what you just mentioned, which is that Unreal Engine. So right before that most recent Matrix movie came out, they released this. It's kind of a demo, kind of a game, but it's an open world environment that you can exist in, that you can explore. And it uses that engine to create this city. And this is an actual screenshot from it. And it really does feel so realistic. If you imagine this is the technology that we have now, if these are the types of environments that we can create for people to exist in the metaverse and for the future, just think about what it will look like in 10 years, what it will look like in 20 years. And if we look at this image in the future, maybe your restaurant brand or maybe your supermarket brand is going to have a little location right there on that street that we're looking at.
Yeah, look, Pong wasn't that long ago, right? 2 lines and a dot, and
Yep.
Now we have this. And there's way more, like, so much more Unreal Engine stuff that you can see as a demo that looks as good or even better than this. It's crazy what they're able to do now.
I know. I was thinking about when we originally got the first Nintendo system and how excited we were, and just the difference between it. And the brands are already existing in the metaverse. So, Chipotle last year, we talked about this on a different webinar, but they opened up a virtual Chipotle in that Roblox game. It was for Halloween. You could go in there, you could get a ticket for a free burrito, and then you could actually go to a real Chipotle location and redeem that token for the burrito.
Okay, to the world of veggies from
and then the next
veggies.
3 we'll move through pretty quickly because these are micro trends, but they're pretty kind of specific trends. And so we always wanted to include something plant-based. And so, you've spoken about this in the past, Jack. We see it when we research trends, but anytime that we see a trend start to grow, we tend to see that kind of opposite reaction happen to it. Whether that's because there's players in the industry and they really, have kind of a reason for them to kind of push back on it, whether that's just, some consumers wanting to push back against the predominant trend. I think a great example was when we saw all of those mashups and we saw, all of those Korean tacos. All of a sudden we saw people saying, I only want authentic foods. I'm really like into authenticity. So we always tend to see that happen. And we're seeing it happen right now with all of the plant-based, analogs, all of the meat analogs. And we're seeing some consumers really push back on them and say, really, I prefer vegetables, or I prefer whole, fruits or, whole produce options. And so I feel like a great example of what you hear a lot is something like, I don't need my peas to pretend to be a cheeseburger. I just want, peas. I just want vegetables. And so like, that's kind of the consumer profile that, really is emblematic of kind of this, idea.
And it's worth noting that this sort of like, counter view exists only because the other thing, plant-based analogs, is itself a trend and a growing trend. So this actually sort of validates the broader trend, but it shows that there is another subgroup of folks that say, hey, I want it this other way too. So both things will grow.
And that's actually, so this next slide is actually, when we ask consumers, do you prefer kind of whole plants and whole vegetables, or do you prefer, analogs that really mimic plant, meats or burgers or milks or whatever it is. And I think, this surprises people, but it surprises people in different ways. I think the thing that is surprising to me is what you just said, Jack, is that 40% of consumers say that they do prefer foods that taste like their traditional counterparts, which wasn't even an option previously. We didn't even necessarily have that. So in a fairly short amount of time, we do have a good percentage of consumers who say, I actually like those plant-based burgers. That is, I would rather have that. I don't necessarily want a whole vegetable.
A lot of headroom to grow, right? I mean,
exactly.
We're far from 40% in terms of consumption right now.
Yeah. But then on the other token, you do see this 60% is incredibly passionate. When you talk to people about it, I think even in the chat, we're seeing it right now, people saying things like, finally, amen, like finally, we're getting back to just those, traditional, fruits and vegetables again. And so that is, a portion of that is a very passionate consumer base.
Some of those things are getting pretty expensive. When I go to the store now, I'm like, whoa, some of this produce has gotten really, really pricey. The oranges are the big one now, right? Aren't prices spiking for oranges and orange juice like crazy?
Yeah. I think I mentioned last time I went to Mariano's, my local supermarket, there's no orange juice to be found.
Huh.
And then we've asked this question every year for the past 3 years, have you been eating plant-based foods and how often? And so we did see a bit of a dip last year. So, the percentage of consumers who now say they eat plant-based foods daily has dipped down to 10%, where it was, prior to COVID at 20%. So we are seeing a bit of a dip in consumers saying that they eat plant-based foods.
Now, is that possibly partially a result of the mental definition of plant-based foods changing over time as it becomes more normalized?
It could be, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm going to move, this is what you were just talking about, Jack. I'll move pretty quickly. I want to make sure we get to some of the foods and flavors at the end, because I know we've been hyping them up for a couple of weeks now. But I think, you do hear this a lot. Well, the only thing keeping consumers from purchasing some of these analogs is that they're more expensive right now. And once we reach price parity, they're going to move over and they're going to start buying some of these items. And for some consumers, that is true. If they are the same price of traditional meat, they will buy them. But we still kind of see that 40-60 split that we saw with the consumers preferring either whole vegetables versus the analogs. We kind of see that same split here in, the number of consumers who say that it won't make a difference for them. And this next slide here, we've asked this for the past few years. And so we still do see, this is the way that consumers want to eat. We did not define it for them, so it is self-defined plant-based proteins, but the number of consumers who say that they want to eat plant-based proteins is, much larger than the number of consumers who say they want to eat other options, with the possible, exception here of seafood. So we do see, I feel like this kind of doesn't get talked about. I mentioned this in a LinkedIn post last week, but consumers really do perceive seafood to be pretty healthy. And so we do see consumers, I know some of the data that we asked consumers, what do you want to eat as we come out of COVID? A large number of consumers said that they want to eat seafood. So I think that's something that we haven't necessarily talked about as much. But consumers...
This goes back pretty far. You've always seen preponderance of people saying they want to increase not just plant-based proteins, but fruits and veggies overall, and also seafood in particular. It's been a long-standing desire. But there are barriers to it, whether it's cost or freshness or availability and whatnot. Or knowing how to make it is a big barrier as well.
Yes, that's the heart of it. And that is, really where the food service side of the industry can really differentiate themselves.
Yeah. And they don't trust themselves. They screw up this expensive seafood they just bought, then it's a disaster. So they'll trust a restaurant instead. But it's got to be an interesting prep. It can't be like just the old school, grilled salmon and call it a day type of thing.
Absolutely. The next section, so if you go to the next slide here, over the past, it's incredible, 2 years of webinars that we've been doing now, we've covered so many of these operators that have done these really interesting out there, ways of translating the hospitality that you would find inside of a restaurant into that delivery or at-home experience. This is probably the weirdest one that, if you remember this one.
This one, it's like the purge.
Yeah. So So it was, it's a high-end restaurant in New York. They were doing this doomsday dinner party. There was multiple hundreds of dollars, but your food was delivered by these, suit-clad wearing, servers wearing these weird masks. They would come into your house. They would set it up for you. They set up music for you. But we tend to, we saw a lot of these different things. The next slide is, maybe a little bit less expensive of a proposition, but it was an operator in New York that was delivering pizzas, wearing those dinosaur costumes. So,
well, I mean, they have people standing on the street corner dressed up in various things like the Statue of Liberty, twirling a sign telling you to come there. So why not deliver like that too? It's cool. I would certainly pay extra for this.
And I think that's the thing. I think the idea that these only have to exist when we're in a pandemic, a lot of these things we could keep doing, particularly into the future, if consumers, like told us in that first section, are going to continue to get delivery and they're going to get takeout in the future. And so we asked consumers about the various, options that they want to see. Over half of consumers said that they would also like to get meals to reheat later in the week with their orders. A third of consumers are very interested in virtual cooking classes. Over 30% of consumers love the idea of online games to unlock deals and freebies. So there's a lot of options that we have as an industry to really engage consumers in their homes, whether that's through takeout or carry out or delivery.
Let's take all the good stuff and keep it going even after COVID.
Exactly, yeah. And we see that with cocktails. We've seen it in Illinois where we're going to have to go cocktail as an option until 2024. But consumers love to go cocktails. I love to go cocktails. And so,
you think that's here to stay? Do you think it gets renewed in perpetuity, or do you think it really ends in 24?
No, I think it will be renewed. Absolutely. By the time it will be such a norm, operators are going to rely on that income. We're not going to go back.
What's the argument against allowing this to continue?
So you do, and you see it in New York a lot right now, is that, a lot of the retailers don't necessarily want to see this, for obvious reasons.
Yep. What is this?
And then I might have a little lag on mine, but I think you're looking at,
mission field?
Yeah, so this was actually Jacqueline on our team covered this in one of our issues of Creative Concepts that looked at the future of casual dining. But this is an operator out of California that they actually deliver their meals with these games that you can play. So it kind of feels like, what are those rooms that everybody's playing?
Rooms?
The escape rooms. So they say it kind of feels like an escape room in your home, but you can uncover clues, you can play a game with your family while you eat, and then you actually send your answers through this app that they have, and it can unlock future deals and games that you play. So it really keeps you engaged with this brand while you're in your home with your family.
So you get entertainment with your food. I don't know, do you all feel this has lasting power, or does it feel gimmicky to you? I don't know.
Well, just imagine how this can merge with the metaverse in the future.
There you go. And that's really scary. Okay. All right. Flavors and ingredients to watch, specific flavors that you want to keep an eye on out for this year. And Mike, do you want to just preview this? Are we talking about these are going to be the absolute biggest movers? Are we talking about early stage stuff that's just getting going? Are these all going to be in ubiquity by the end of the year? How are we looking at these?
No, exactly. Early stage stuff. So, we want to be the ones that bring you the things when you see them, down the line on a menu, or when you start working with them in your retail products, you saw it here first. A lot of the things that we see on these lists are things that you probably already knew were trending. You probably knew they were trending from a report that you did from us. You don't need us to tell you that, yuzu is growing X% on menus, in the year ahead. And so we tend to take, a really kind of far outlook when we look at some of the foods and flavors to watch.
All right, let's start it then.
And we won't do all 10. We don't have time for all 10. We only have 5 minutes here, but we'll get through as many as we can. And so the first one on our list is black salt. And so we tend to see this happen a lot, where if we see an ingredient being used in one particular application, we see chefs really get used to it and they look for new applications. So black salt, which is sometimes called, and I'm going to mispronounce this, kalanamak or kalanamak. It's a salt that grows in the Himalayas at the base of volcanoes. And so it has this really sulfurous quality to it, which doesn't sound appetizing, but if you add it to plant-based egg dishes, it gives those egg dishes that same sulfurous quality that you associate with eggs. So we saw it being used a lot in all of these plant-based egg dishes. Well, now chefs are like, where else can I put it, on the menu, or where else can I put it into, our retail products? And the example on the next screen, this is an ice cream brand. This is Malai ice cream. And they actually include the black salt in a caramel that they swirl into their royal cinnamon icing to give it that really, it is a unique flavor. It can be a bit of a polarizing flavor, but we do see, chefs really looking for new applications for it.
It's like $14 ice cream or something really expensive.
It probably is, yeah. I mean, they use burlap and barrel spices, which are great, but pricey.
Speaking of ice cream.
This one, this is one that's a little bit closer in. I feel like people that are watching today have probably, tried some of these already. But we've seen those, non-dairy milk alternatives really growing so much. At this point, oat milk is really kind of becoming a norm for many consumers. We actually have a section on that in the full report. And so we see all of those non-dairy alternatives, particularly the, more unusual varieties, not necessarily the almond milks, but, the kind of the next level varieties moving into new categories. And so one of the main categories is ice cream. So we're going to see a lot more of these non-dairy ice creams that use, some of these alternative milks. So this is Doozy Pots from Wonder Lab, and they use hemp milk to make their dairy-free ice cream. I guess I won't call it ice cream.
Sounds good.
Sickle Pack. So this is the one I feel like maybe one because it has kind of a memorable name, but once you hear about this, you're going to start to see it everywhere because we felt the same way. Once we started, seeing it, once we started researching it, we see it everywhere on menus. But so it comes from the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. It's actually a Mayan saucer spread that's made with pepitas and tomatoes. So it's made with pumpkin seeds and tomatoes. And, if you're looking kind of for that next level version of guacamole or that next level version of hummus, we see, a lot of those Latin and Mexican operators, including this on the menu. The example that we have on the next screen here comes from Maze 64, which is an operator out of Washington, D.C. And this is their veggie tostada. So you can see at the bottom here, they have that layer of sickle pack. And then on top of it, they do jicama, bell peppers, seaweed, cucumber, red onions. There's a red chili emulsion, and then there's a cilantro in there as well.
So you'll find this at sort of progressive, innovative, fine dining types of places. Will you find this at traditional restaurants, long-standing restaurants too, or is it really only in the high end right now?
In the US, absolutely. You'll find it, in the traditional restaurants where there are pockets of, Mexican consumers, or when it's, close to the Mexican border. In Mexico, you see it everywhere. When, we were doing research about, where we find it on menus, you see it, on a wide range of menus in Mexico itself.
It's gotta be weird, like having something you've eaten your whole life all of a sudden become like the hot food trend in the country. It's kind of, I'm sure that's happened many, many times.
We can get into that. And then, so we actually talked about this on a webinar previously, but, Indian pizza, we've seen a number of operators across the country really start to see some extreme growth recently. The example on the next page here is an operator out of California. They've been getting a ton of press. Curry Pizza House, they have a dozen locations. They have a bunch more on the way. But it's all these QSR and fast casual pizza operators that specifically focus on Indian foods and flavors. So you see pizzas that have tikka masala on them. You see pizzas that have butter chicken on them. And it is a particular type of operator. And we see them, kind of popping up in all of these various markets across the country. And they're delicious. They're absolutely delicious.
That sounds awesome.
Really a way to introduce consumers.
Is the dough any different? Is it like naan or is it?
Some of them, yeah, some do use, some of the spices that you would associate with Indian cuisine in the dough itself.
Yeah, I love this mural too, but I actually don't know what it means. Is she supposed to represent she represents the customer and saying, I don't want you as the restaurant to tell me what I can and can't have? Is that the,
yeah,
I don't know. I don't understand what it means. It's cool though. Hearts of Palm. I think we talked about this.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at Hearts of Palm, I don't think there's anybody, listening today that's not familiar with Hearts of Palm. And so it is one of those trends that came back because there was a new trend that was driving it, which of course is plant-based foods. And we see Hearts of Palm being used in all of those seafood alternatives, but then we also see it in all of these, carb alternatives. Actually, the Hearts of Palm pasta is Trader Joe's top selling pasta across all pastas, not just plant-based pastas. That's their top selling pasta overall.
Is Hearts of Palm sort of like the new cauliflower sort of?
It could, yeah. We do see a lot of, the options where you would see cauliflower being subbed in. We see a lot of Hearts of Palm being subbed in. And part of that is because it still has that kind of al dente consistency that you associate with noodles.
And I know we're running out of time. Asian rum?
Yeah, really quickly, Asian rum. I think it surprises people that they really believe that rum actually originally came from Asia, which maybe is less surprising when you consider where sugarcane comes from. But there's a number of distilleries throughout Asia that are really kind of embracing this past and really interesting micro distilleries that are doing some really, really creative rum varieties out of Asia. And I think we're going to see them a lot more on menus in the future.
And finally, or is this finally? I don't know.
Yep, this is finally, really quickly, it's the only wild pepper native to North America. And the next example here, you see it a lot in the Southwest, but this is Arizona Wilderness Brewing Company. These are chiltepin peppers, and they use these in a brew. If you are in the Southwest, you're probably familiar with these and you've seen them on menus, but the American consumer's appetite for spicy foods continues to grow year after year. And so we have this wild variety that, is available to us here in the States. And so there is an opportunity for it to grow.
What does it taste like and what do we find it in?
They are spicy, so they are particularly spicy, but it is pretty quick spice, so it dissipates pretty quickly.
But it's not just a beverage flavor, we're seeing it in dishes.
Oh, no, absolutely. Well. Seeing it in dishes. It tends to be dried. It tends to be a dried pepper variety that you can use.
And here's the
I know we ask this question every year, but this is really what we want to leave people with. Most consumers, they really are looking forward to new ideas and foods and flavors and ingredients in the future. 3/4 of consumers are looking forward to them in 2022. And so it's really on us to give them those, exciting new options that they want to see.
Absolutely. And we've said this a million times and we'll say it a million more, but consumers continue to tell us they want new stuff now. It's time, and I think the industry has responded pretty well by continuing with their beat of innovation. I know you had one last slide here, Mike. You want to talk about this?
Oh, yeah. So, and I think you presented this previously in the past, but we did ask consumers, how do you feel about the year ahead? And we said, just throw out one word, whatever word comes to mind. And hope and hopeful were more than twice as likely to come up as any other word. So consumers really do feel hopeful about the year ahead. And I feel like after our last webinar, I think we, kind of feel the same way. So hopefully 2022 is going to bring a lot of successes for people listening today.
I think it is. And I hope many of you stayed with us 3 minutes past the hour. And thank you for that. Mike, tremendous job as always. Thank you, everyone.